In 1812, while France's Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was busy with a military campaign in Russia, there was an attempt to overthrow him back in Paris. Find out who was behind it, what they did, and how it all turned out in this episode of Footnoting History. Hey everyone, Christine here, excited to go back to my roots of covering Napoleonic history, that is. For a time, it was basically all I did, and I regret that I got away from that, so here we are, reunited. If you missed out on any of my older Napoleonic episodes, they covered everything from how to avoid serving in his army to stories of his fascinating family members. You can find a link to them on the entry for this episode on footnotinghistory.com and a playlist of them on our YouTube channel. Those are also the same places you are guaranteed to have the audio for these episodes with captions, if that's something you're interested in. Now, on to Napoleon and the attempt to overthrow him. Our action today occurs from October to December of 1812. Okay, that's great and all, I hear you say, but please give us some context so everything makes sense. Smart idea. Keeping in mind that, for the sake of time, this is very much the abbreviated version of events. Let's take a look at things. By 1812, Napoleon had been a prime mover in French and broader European politics for quite some time. He worked his way up in the French army in the second half of the 1700s, right through the infamous French Revolution that replaced the monarchy with the Republic. In 1799, he really put himself front and center. He staged a coup that overthrew the Directorate. That was the government that formed after the heaviest days of the Revolution, and its guillotine were well done. From then, he never went away. Instead, he made sure he was creating a new version of France where his family was the ruling one. As part of that, in December of 1804, Napoleon and his wife Josephine were crowned emperor and empress. Once he established the empire, Napoleon was everywhere, even more so than before. He spent a lot of time trying to spread his power, using military strength and sometimes diplomacy to put family members on thrones around Europe and making politically astute marriage matches for them too. Given that he had taken over France and was pressing himself upon other countries, it won't surprise you to hear me say he had a lot of enemies. For our purposes, the ones within France are the most important. Here, they fell into numerous groups with various gripes. The most significant gripes were on the opposite ends of the spectrum. First, there were the Republicans, those who were mad that he established what was essentially a new version of the monarchy, when the people of France had worked so hard to overthrow the monarchy and become people-led not long ago. The other side of this consisted of the Royalists, those who thought the monarchy should never have been done away with in the first place, and wanted the old family, well, the members of it that hadn't been executed, to be back in charge. Despite these haters, Napoleon also had a ton of internal support, especially from members of the military, and he was very good at a lot of things, which enabled him to have some pretty big successes, especially, again, where the military was concerned. What he didn't have, though, was a secure family line. While he had two stepchildren he loved, Eugene and Hortense, who were Josephine's children from her first marriage, the couple had no children of their own. Eventually, Napoleon was forced to divorce Josephine and marry a younger woman, Marie-Louise of Austria, who gave him the son he wanted to help his dynasty continue. He had, he hoped, done what he needed to secure the Bonapartes ruling the French Empire for a long time to come. As you probably gathered, Napoleon's tenure as emperor was one of perpetual warfare. So it's not surprising that in 1812, Napoleon was out of Paris, leading his army in yet another campaign. This is the infamous Russian campaign. From the French perspective, to call it a disaster is to be kind. It was a near annihilation of Napoleon's army. There are basically no positive takeaways from the Russian campaign if you were Napoleon or one of his supporters. And while Napoleon and his grand army were away, Paris was not quiet, at least not on one night in late October. Yes, listeners, we've made it to the main event. So, while Napoleon is off failing in Russia, a man in Paris is hatching a plan. The man was Claude-François de Malet. Like Napoleon, Malet had a history with the military. Unlike Napoleon, it wasn't a famously successful one. Although he was a general, Malet was no longer active in the role. He had what can best be called a checkered military record. In 1812, he was in his late 50s, an ardent Republican, and most importantly, anti-Napoleon. He hadn't liked Napoleon from the start of his government takeover, and he certainly hadn't grown to like Napoleon when he became emperor. In fact, he disliked Napoleon so much that in 1808 he was arrested for participating in a Republican plot to overthrow him. That attempted coup, however, didn't get very far. Indeed, it didn't get off the ground. The same wouldn't be the case next time. About 2 years after Malet was arrested for wanting Napoleon gone, he was moved from prison to a private sanatorium. This was allegedly due to health issues, and as a result, it was very common, for a long time, for historians to simply dismiss Malet as a madman. Thierry Lentz, who heads the Fondation Napoleon and has studied and written about Malet at length, offered a more nuanced take on his condition. He said in an interview, quote, "Whilst it cannot be denied that the man had an obsessive-compulsive side, it must also be recognized that he was not lacking in either courage or intelligence, nor a certain practical savoir-faire in his undertakings." This is certainly true enough, given what Malet planned and enacted in the fall of 1812. From within the sanatorium, which historian Monroe Price described as the early 19th century equivalent of an open prison, Malet was able to take advantage of the lax security and spearhead a plan that would, he hoped, get rid of Napoleon for good. One night at the end of October, the 22nd going into the 23rd, Malet escaped from the sanatorium to put his plan into action. He set off in the direction of a barracks, wearing military attire and armed with forged documents, including one that claimed to be from the Senate. They not only claimed Napoleon was dead, but also named a new provisional government to replace him. This new provisional government is a funny thing, because it contained names that were well known, and people that had a history of being upset with the empire. However, many of these alleged provisional government members also had no idea who Malet was or that they were included. Presumably, Malet hoped that if he succeeded, these people would want to jump on board. Until then, he was okay with involving them without their knowledge. He arrived at the barracks and stated his case. Napoleon was dead, the provisional government was now in charge, and he needed troops to support him during the changeover. He showed his paperwork, and in a move that would have television viewers gasp if this was part of a scripted drama, he was actually given troops to help him. Historians' estimates differ. For example, Monroe Price refers to there being several hundred troops, while Andrew Roberts cites the number as 1,200 members of the National Guard. Regardless, it was hardly something to sneeze at. It also would have given heft to his claims. If he had soldiers with him, surely he must be legit, right? With his new contingent of duped supporters, Malet made his way to the infamous prison La Force. There, he pulled the same routine with his fake orders, and he called for the release of two specific prisoners, La Horie and Guidal. They were fellow Republican-leaning generals who disliked Napoleon. La Horie was the more put-together of the two, while Guidal was a heavy drinker and more of a live wire. Both, though, were happy to be freed and join the cause. Now, with 3 men to lead things, they continued with the government takeover. Time was, of course, of the essence. The next step was fairly simple. Visit, and, if necessary, wake up, because, remember, this was the middle of the night, people of note for the government of Paris, and lock them up. I imagine it felt pretty sweet for those who had been in prison to now be the ones doing the imprisoning. The Minister of Police was the first on the agenda. He was woken up and thrown in prison. Similarly seen as worthy of being targeted and thrown behind bars was the Prefect of Police and Chief of Security. Later, Napoleon's stepdaughter Hortense would write that Parisians were amused by knowing that officials were dragged to prison by people who were supposed to be behind bars themselves. However, it was certainly no laughing matter to those involved. Eventually, Malet brought his coup to General Hulin in the Place Vendôme. It was a mistake. Hulin was a badass. At present, he was a military governor of Paris, but his life included being an active leader in the storming of the Bastille, being a part of Napoleon's army, and being made a Grand Officer of the Legion of Honor. He was certainly no pushover, and he didn't buy what Malet was selling. In response to this, instead of keeping calm, Malet decided to shoot him in the face. Certainly this wasn't the smartest action to take. Malet then encountered one of Hulin's supporting officers, Doucet. Doucet recognized all was not right, quickly apprehended Malet, likely tied him to a chair, and raised the general alarm about what was actually happening in Paris that night. If you're worried about Ulan, you need not be. He survived. However, the remnants of the shot could never be removed from his jaw, and there were some who called him Bullet Eater in the years that followed. He lived for another almost 30 years. Anyway, once the coup attempt was uncovered, things escalated quickly. Malet and his crew were swiftly arrested. The officials that had been arrested were freed. The soldiers Malet had taken control of were returned to their true occupations of working for the actual government. The Imperial Guard was used to bring the city back to order. Everything was done that you'd expect to happen when you're trying to stop someone from taking over the reins of control. Now, you might be asking yourself, who was actually in charge while Napoleon was away? That role belonged to Cambaceres, one of Napoleon's long-time most trusted associates. Although, again, due to the whole overnight thing and how quickly it happened, he didn't learn about the coup until after it was nearly stopped, and he was quick on his reaction game. He made sure the Empress and her son were safe, handled the statement for the press, held meetings with officials, and took charge over arranging the process for dealing with those involved. The process was a military trial or court-martial. One particularly interesting bit from the trial is that when questioned about the coup and his accomplices, Malet said that had he been successful, everyone would have been his accomplices. Honestly, he probably wasn't wrong. One can see the perspective that had he successfully caused a change in government, everyone who validated his actions and upheld them would have been participating alongside him. None of this mattered, though, because the coup failed. The actual result of it was that Malet and many of those labeled his co-conspirators were executed before October was over, and therefore, before Napoleon even learned what had taken place. It was all over as swiftly as it began. As much wow factor as this event has, causing people to pause and marvel at the audacity of it all, it's hard to imagine a world where it would have ever been successful. Even if Malet and his assisting parties had gotten farther in their plan, they would have had to count on either Napoleon actually being killed while in Russia, or people choosing to stick with Malet and crew over Napoleon when they learned the emperor was still alive. Of course, it was possible Napoleon could be killed at any time, but it wasn't exactly a guarantee. And in Napoleon's absence, who is to say that the French people would have accepted Malet anyway? They were certainly not shy about getting rid of rulers in this period. The odds were never in Malet's favor. And of course, Napoleon did come back to Paris eventually. Word was sent to Napoleon quickly, but this was 1812, and people weren't exactly emailing or making phone calls, so he didn't receive it until early November. He was pretty darn busy trying to keep at least some of his army alive during their crushing Russian campaign, so he couldn't just turn around and leave. His return to Paris didn't occur until December, which means that the attempted coup was little more than a memory, and Malet and his associates were dead for over a month. It was still important for him to return and show his face and make sure everything was how it should be, secure. Napoleon, we know, had worked very hard to make sure he had a wife who could give him a son, and with that son born, he hoped he was establishing a dynasty that would last. However, while the Malet attempt didn't succeed, it had gone far enough to make Napoleon worry. After all, none of the officials who believed Malet's lies had given so much as a pause of thought to the fact that if Napoleon died, the next ruler should be his son. If you also didn't think of Napoleon's son when I was telling this story, you're forgiven. However, you are allowed to be caught up in the moment. French officials definitely should not have been. Their minds should have immediately thought, okay, time to rally around the son who is now Napoleon II. Yes, his son was a child, but it was certainly not uncommon for a child to inherit a throne when their ruling parent died early. That the coup didn't cause people to immediately rally around his son alarmed Napoleon, and rightfully so. As it stood, the dynasty centered solely on himself. The Bonapartes, as a whole, had not been accepted, or maybe it's better to say, they had not been so heavily embedded as the ideal ruling dynasty into the consciousness of the French people that they would naturally rally around the next in line Bonaparte to take the crown. Napoleon's concern was well known. When writing his memoirs, Napoleon's valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, noted that the Malet attempted coup, quote, offered new proof of the negligence of all segments of the administration when he, that is Napoleon, was not there to direct their moves. Everything therefore relied on him, on his own person. He had to be everywhere. Napoleon's stepdaughter Hortense made similar observations in her memoirs. She said, rather pointedly, that Napoleon, quote, felt that those who should have protected his dynasty had shown a contemptible spirit of vacillation and lack of decision in this affair. He was greatly concerned about it. Certainly, Napoleon wasn't going to leave for the front again without making sure things were in better order. He couldn't force people to view his dynasty as more established than it was, though if he could have figured out a way to do just that, I'm sure he would have. However, what he could do was have the Senate confirm that in his absence, his wife, the Empress Marie-Louise, would be regent for their son. He further appointed a regency council, featuring all the usual suspects who were already running things when he was away, to try and solidify a recognized chain of succession to the best of his ability. Ultimately, Malet's coup attempt is one of those events that is fascinating and a little bit bizarre, but was never going to be a romping success. What it did do, however, was get into Napoleon's head by underscoring that the dynastic stability he desperately wanted to achieve did not yet exist. At the end of 1812, he was still emperor, but the glory of his ascendancy was in the past, and he was right to worry. After all, with the benefit of being from 200 years later, we know that only a few short years later, Napoleon would be exiled from France for good, and it wouldn't be his son who took over. In fact, it would take multiple periods of unrest and several decades before another Bonaparte ruled France. That one would be Napoleon's nephew, the son of his brother Louis and the aforementioned stepdaughter Hortense. He called himself Napoleon III, holding a place for Napoleon I's son who had never ruled. But one can hardly blame Napoleon I, lacking the ability to know the future, for finding Malet's ability to have even a modicum of success to be a massive problem. If I were him, I would have too. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Footnoting History. It was great to return to my favorite time period. As always, for further reading suggestions and to learn how you can help us keep this podcast going, visit footnotinghistory.com. And don't forget, the best stories are in the footnotes.